An act of violence takes less than a second. But in that second, at an event filled with the city's most powerful people, one witness decided the consequences would last a lifetime. This is not a story about a rescue. It's about what happens when a predator meets a more dangerous one, and a private humiliation becomes a very public execution. The setting was a $500,000 a plate charity gala. The victim was a society wife, and the man who intervened wasn't a hero, he was a documented crime boss. This confrontation forces us to ask a dangerous question. In the desperate fight to stop a predator, is it ever right to unleash a bigger one? To understand that moment, you must first understand the three lives that collided there. First, the husband. Jonathan Pierce was a titan of private equity, a man who built a $2 billion empire on a simple, brutal formula. Identify weakness, apply maximum pressure, and never ever show mercy. To the financial world, he was a genius. To the charities he funded, a patron saint. But behind the walls of his $20 million penthouse, that same relentless pressure had a different target, his wife, Elena. Elena Pierce, née Morty, was the perfect society asset. An heiress to a faded hotel fortune, she provided Jonathan with the old money pedigree he craved. Photographs from that time show a woman of ethereal beauty, but with eyes that seemed to hold a silent, desperate calculation. Friends later recalled her flinching at sudden noises, her habit of wearing long sleeves even in summer, and the way her laughter would cut off abruptly the moment Jonathan entered the room. The abuse wasn't a secret to everyone. A former housekeeper, speaking under condition of anonymity, stated she witnessed Jonathan grab Elena by the hair and slam her head against a marble countertop in 2019 after she served wine he deemed substandard. The housekeeper was paid a six-figure settlement and made to sign a non-disclosure agreement the next day. This was the unspoken rule of their world. Problems were contained, reputations were preserved, and the machinery of luxury kept humming. Which brings us to the third player, already watching from the shadows. His name was Vincent Sokolov. To law enforcement agencies in 3 countries, he was the head of the Sokolov*Bratva*, a transnational organization with tentacles in construction, waste management, and high-stakes gambling. To the elite of the city, he was a reclusive, wildly generous philanthropist, a man who gave 7-figure donations without seeking a seat on the board or a plaque with his name. This duality was his camouflage. The charity gala was his hunting ground. For Vincent, philanthropy wasn't about altruism. It was a sophisticated market for trading in the most valuable commodity of all, obligation. Every donation was a carefully placed marker, a future favor owed by a politician, a judge, or a CEO like Jonathan Pierce. He had been cultivating Jonathan for over a year, funding a development project that was, in reality, a complex money laundering operation. But Jonathan had gotten greedy, skimming millions from the scheme, believing the sophisticated banker could outwit the ruthless gangster. The night of the Autumn Hope Gala, tensions were at a breaking point. Jonathan was nervous, facing not only Vincent's simmering anger over the stolen funds, but also a looming SEC investigation into his fund's practices. Elena, for her part, had reached her own private limit. A source close to her confirms she had retained a divorce attorney that very afternoon and had hidden the retainer agreement in her jewelry case. She planned to leave him. She just needed to survive the public spectacle of the gala first. The event was a sea of tuxedos and gowns worth more than most homes. Crystal glittered, champagne flowed, and a silent auction featured a luxury car with a bidding war that started at $250,000. Vincent Sokolov sat at the head table, a position of honor. He was impeccably dressed, calm, speaking in low tones with a senator on his right. But his eyes, cold and analytical, periodically tracked Jonathan Pierce's movements across the ballroom. Jonathan, feeling the pressure, drank heavily. Witnesses said he became increasingly abrasive, publicly correcting Elena on trivial details, his grip on her elbow growing conspicuously tight during conversations. The mask of the perfect couple was cracking under the strain of his rage and fear. Alina maintained a porcelain smile, but her posture was rigid, a marionette held by taut, invisible strings. Then came the moment in the lobby, away from the main din but still within view of dozens. An argument, hushed but intense. Jonathan needed Alina to perform a specific gesture, to personally invite the chair of the SEC's enforcement division to their table to use her charm as a human shield. She refused. It was a small rebellion, but for a man like Jonathan, used to absolute compliance, it was an unforgivable betrayal. He seized her forearm, not a dramatic swinging blow, but a compact, brutal compression of muscle and bone, his fingers digging into the precise spot where a week-old bruise was already fatting to yellow. Security camera footage, later obtained by investigators, shows Alina's face contorting in pain, her free hand flying up instinctively. She didn't cry out. She had been trained not to. She simply went very, very still. A prey animal hopping the predator will lose interest. But another predator had seen everything. From his vantage point near a towering floral arrangement, Vincent Sokolov watched the entire exchange. His expression did not change. He did not frown or show anger. He simply set his champagne flute down on a passing waiter's tray with a finality that sounded like a verdict. The senator beside him, mid-sentence, stopped talking, unnerved by the sudden shift in the man's energy. Vincent's bodyguard, a massive man named Leo, leaned in. Vincent gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. This was the collision. A brutal husband at the end of his control, a wife who had just dared to say no, and a crime boss who had just witnessed a breach of a different code, not of law, but of respect. In Vincent's world, a man who could not control his temper was weak. A man who abused a woman in his protection was contemptible. And a man who owed you millions while displaying such weakness was not just a debtor, but an insult. Vincent began to move through the crowd, not with haste, but with the terrible, slow certainty of a glacier. People instinctively parted before him. The ambient noise of the gala seemed to dampen in his wake. He walked past billionaires and celebrities, his target locked. He was not coming to comfort Alina. He was coming to settle accounts. Jonathan, finally sensing a shift in the atmosphere, released Alina's arm. He turned, and the color drained from his face. He was not looking at a philanthropist. He was looking at the man whose money he had stolen, whose patience he had exhausted, and who was now walking toward him with a calm that was more terrifying than any shout. Alina, clutching her injured arm, looked from her husband's panic to the approaching storm, and in that moment she understood one terrifying truth. The gala was over, the performance was done, and the only man who could possibly protect her from Jonathan was the most dangerous man in the room. Vincent Sokolov stopped 3 feet from Jonathan Pierce. The entire lobby had fallen into a silence so complete you could hear the ice melting in a discarded glass. He didn't look at Alina. He didn't raise his voice. He simply addressed Jonathan with a tone of bored disappointment that cut deeper than any shout. "Jonathan," Vincent said, his voice carrying in the hushed space, "we have a problem. You owe me $8.4 million. You are 47 days late." A nervous titter rippled through a few guests, quickly stifled. This was about money. In this crowd, a debt was embarrassing but not extraordinary. Jonathan seized on the lifeline, forcing a banker's smile. "Vincent, of course. A temporary liquidity issue. We can discuss this Monday in my office." Vincent held up a single hand. The gesture was not aggressive, but it silenced Jonathan instantly. "The money is secondary," Vincent continued, his eyes now flicking to Alina's arm, which she still cradled against her body. "The problem is your character. A man who cannot control his hands in public cannot be trusted with a partnership. A man who treats his own wife as a punching bag has no honor. And a man with no honor," he paused, letting the words hang, "is a liability to everyone in this room." The air left the space. This wasn't about a debt. This was a public excommunication. Jonathan's face flushed a deep, mottled red. "How dare you? This is a private matter." "It stopped being private the moment you laid hands on her in front of 200 witnesses." Vincent interrupted, his voice still calm. You see, in my business we have a rule. We do not tolerate rats, and we do not tolerate men who are weak where it counts. He took a half step closer, and Jonathan actually flinched backward. So here is what will happen. By 9 a.m. Monday, my $8.4 million will be returned with a 20% penalty for the delay. That is the business. But for the insult to my intelligence for making me watch this display, there is a different price. He then turned his head, making deliberate eye contact with three specific people in the crowd: the CEO of the largest bank in the state, the editor-in-chief of the city's flagship newspaper, and the chair of the hospital board where Jonathan was a major donor. To each, he gave a nearly imperceptible nod. Then Vincent delivered the sentence that would become legend. He spoke it clearly, directly to Jonathan, but for the benefit of the entire room. From this moment, Jonathan Pierce, you are a ghost. Your money will vanish. Your friends will not know you. Your name will open no doors. You are finished. He didn't shout. He didn't curse. He stated it as a simple, irrevocable fact. And in that gilded room, filled with people who understood real power, everyone knew it was true. The threat wasn't physical violence. It was social and financial annihilation, delivered with the cold precision of a surgeon. The pivot happened in the next 5 seconds. Jonathan, humiliated and enraged, made a catastrophic error. He pointed a trembling finger at Vincent. You criminal, you think you can threaten me. I'll have you investigated. I'll ruin you. Vincent's lips curved into a smile that held no warmth whatsoever. Please do. Start with the Harborview Development Project. I'm sure the Securities and Exchange Commission would be very interested in your accounting there. Jonathan's bravado evaporated, replaced by raw panic. Vincent had just publicly linked him to the very fraud he was trying to hide. In that moment, the narrative for everyone present shifted. This wasn't a mobster shaking down a businessman. This was a corrupt financier being called to account by a man who, however dubious his methods, was upholding a twisted form of justice. The sympathy in the room, what little there was for Jonathan, dissolved. Vincent then did the unexpected. He turned to Alina. For the first time, his demeanor changed. The cold fury softened into something more inscrutable. He didn't touch her. He simply inclined his head slightly. Mrs. Pierce, my driver, Leo, is at the south entrance. He will take you wherever you wish to go. Tonight and any night you require it. This is not an offer. It is a courtesy. Alina stared at him, tears finally breaking free, tracing clean lines through her makeup. She looked at Jonathan, who was now frantically whispering into his phone, ignoring her completely. She looked at the crowd of her so-called friends who were already turning away, already calculating the risk of association. Then she looked back at Vincent Sokolov, the man who had just burned her husband's world to the ground in 30 seconds. She didn't speak. She just nodded once, a sharp, decisive motion. Then she turned and walked toward the south entrance, head high, not looking back. The gala did not resume. It disintegrated. Within minutes, the story was leaking via encrypted texts and hushed calls. By the time Jonathan stormed out 10 minutes later, his key business ally had already publicly stepped away for a family emergency. The news cycle, always hungry, began to stir. But this was only the first wave. Vincent Sokolov's threat was not a metaphor. It was a set of operational orders. That very night, a sequence of events was triggered that followed the brutal logic of organized crime, repurposed for the digital age. First, the financial siege. At 2:17 a.m., a shell company in Cyprus that held $30 million of Jonathan's offshore capital received simultaneous withdrawal requests from 3 separate creditor entities, all later traced to Sokolov affiliates. The funds were frozen in transit. At the same time, a dossier of documents detailing Jonathan's fraudulent inflation of assets in the Harborview project was anonymously delivered to the SEC, the FBI, and 3 major financial news outlets. The source material was impeccable, far better than anything regulators had compiled. It was, as one investigator later said, a guided missile of evidence. Second, the social demolition. By 8 a.m. the next morning, every board on which Jonathan served had received an identical, impeccably worded email suggesting his immediate removal to protect the institution's reputation during the forthcoming scrutiny. Each email was followed by a personal call from someone influential, a retired judge, a major donor, strongly endorsing the idea. This was the obligation market in action. Vincent was calling in his favors, not for profit but for destruction. The media pivot was the masterstroke. Instead of the expected crime boss narrative, the story that broke was philanthropist confronts abusive tycoon. A celebrity gossip site, ironically owned by a holding company Sokolov financed, ran the headline, Gala Guardian, billionaire shamed for hurting wife. The article focused almost entirely on Jonathan's abuse, with Vincent framed as a mysterious but principled bystander. The photo that went viral wasn't of Vincent threatening Jonathan. It was the moment afterward, with Alina's tear-streaked, resolute face as she walked away. The court of public opinion had its villain and, shockingly, its anti-hero. Jonathan Pierce was in his penthouse, watching his life unravel on 4 different screens when the call came from his lead attorney. The SEC had formally opened an investigation. 2 banks had called his lines of credit. His flagship fund was facing a cascade of investor redemption requests totaling over $400 million. It's a coordinated attack, Jonathan, his lawyer said, voice hollow. And they're using our own playbook. They're making you toxic. Meanwhile, Alina Pierce was in a safe house apartment owned by one of Vincent's real estate shells. She had not spoken to Vincent again, but his protection was absolute. A female security detail was posted outside. A lawyer specializing in high-net-worth divorce and protective orders was already on retainer, paid from an anonymous trust. For the first time in years, she slept through the night. But the central, troubling question remained. What was Vincent Sokolov's true endgame? Recovering his money was one thing, but the surgical, multi-pronged annihilation of Jonathan Pierce went far beyond collection. It was a message, and as the business world scrambled to understand the new rules, a more frightening theory emerged. This wasn't just about one bad debt. This was a hostile takeover of an entire reputation. Vincent Sokolov, the shadowy mobster, was using Jonathan Pierce's very public downfall to rebrand himself. He was laundering his own image, using the currency of a billionaire's ruin. He was demonstrating to the elite that his power was not just violent, but systemic, that he could break a man using the very institutions meant to protect him. And as the sun rose on Monday morning, with Jonathan's stock portfolio already down 20% in pre-market trading, the final piece of the threat clicked into place. An encrypted message, its origin untraceable, appeared on Jonathan's private server. It contained a single sentence. The penalty is paid. The lesson continues. The lesson. This was the pivot that reframed everything. Vincent Sokolov wasn't just punishing Jonathan. He was making an example of him. He was showing every powerful man in the city the cost of crossing him, yes. But he was also, perversely, establishing a new, brutal standard of conduct. Abuse your wife, and you answer to me. The consequences spiraled outward. Domestic violence hotlines in the city reported a 30% increase in calls from high-income neighborhoods over the next 72 hours. Fear, it seemed, worked both ways. Wives saw a path to safety, however dangerous. Husbands saw the abyss. And Alina Pierce, sipping tea in her safe house, watched the news coverage with a strange, detached calm. Her lawyer slid a document across the table. It was a divorce petition, citing extreme cruelty. It also included a forensic accounting appendix that detailed the hidden assets Jonathan had been frantically trying to shield. The source of the information was, of course, anonymous. She picked up the pen. She had just become the most famous victim in the country and the most protected. But protection has a price. As she signed her name, the door to the suite opened. Not Leo, the driver, not her new lawyer. Vincent Sokolov stood in the doorway, having entered without a sound. He was no longer in a tuxedo, but a simple black sweater and trousers. He looked at the signed papers, then at her. "It's done?" he asked. "It started," she corrected, her voice steady. He nodded, a flicker of that same inscrutable expression in his eyes. "The financial unraveling will take months. The criminal charges perhaps years. He will fight. He will try to reach you." Alina met his gaze. "What happens when he does?" For the first time, Vincent Sokolov's smile reached his eyes. It was not a comforting sight. "Then we enter the second phase," he said softly, "and the lesson becomes permanent." The line had been crossed. What began as a public confrontation was now a private war, with Alina Pierce as the unwilling prize and Vincent Sokolov as her terrifying guardian. But in the world of power and violence, guardianship is just another form of possession. And as Jonathan Pierce gathered his remaining resources for a counterattack, a more dangerous truth became clear. In stopping a monster, Alina might have just placed herself in the cage of a dragon. Jonathan Pierce did not go quietly into the night. He was a billionaire with a predator's instinct, and a cornered predator is the most dangerous kind. His counterattack would not target Vincent Sokolov directly. He couldn't. Instead, he aimed at the one target he thought he still controlled: his wife. The first salvo was legal. Jonathan's lawyers filed an emergency motion, claiming Alina was mentally incompetent and under the coercive influence of a known criminal element. They submitted affidavits from a psychiatrist Jonathan had paid, diagnosing her with shared psychotic disorder and claiming her allegations of abuse were fantasies. It was a classic abuser's tactic: pathologize the victim. But it was also the opening move in a much darker strategy. Because Jonathan had a backup plan. For years, he had kept a digital insurance file. It didn't contain his own crimes. It contained Alina's, or rather, it contained a meticulously constructed fiction of her crimes. Forged emails showed her authorizing fraudulent transfers. Edited audio clips, created using cutting-edge voice synthesis software he'd invested in, had her discussing money laundering with unnamed associates. He had been preparing this narrative for years, a doomsday weapon to ensure she could never testify against him. Now, he would use it to drag her down with him. He leaked a fraction of this material to a tabloid. The headline was vicious: "Gala Wife's Secret Ties to Mob Money." The story twisted Vincent Sokolov's protection into proof of a long-running conspiracy between Alina and the Bratva to embezzle from Jonathan's funds. The public narrative, so recently in her favor, began to curdle. Online comments shifted from sympathy to suspicion. The perfect victim was now a possible accomplice. This was the "wait, it gets worse" moment. Vincent's public shamming had not liberated Alina. It had made her a higher-value target in her husband's war for survival. The abuse had entered a new, digital phase. Jonathan's goal was no longer to control her in their home, but to destroy her credibility in the court of public opinion, thereby nullifying her divorce claims and any future testimony. When Alina saw the headlines in her safe house, she didn't cry. She went very still, then calmly picked up a vase and threw it against the wall. The crash brought Leo, the bodyguard, into the room. She looked at him, her breath coming in sharp gasps. "Get him," she said, her voice shaking with a fury she had never allowed herself to feel. "Get Vincent, now." Vincent arrived within the hour. He listened as Alina's new lawyer, a razor-sharp woman named Claire, outlined Jonathan's legal and media assault. Vincent's expression remained unreadable. When Claire finished, he asked a single question: "The forgeries, how good are they?" Claire hesitated. "Professionally done. To a jury or to the public, they could be persuasive. We can fight them, but it will take time and the damage to her reputation." "Reputation is not the battlefield," Vincent interrupted softly. He turned to Alina. "He wants you to fight on his terms, in courts, in newspapers. He wants you to play a game where he owns the board, the pieces, and the rule book. We will not play that game." He then revealed the first major pivot in his own strategy. Vincent Sokolov was not in the business of winning arguments. He was in the business of eliminating problems. There are two ways to discredit a lie, he explained, his tone that of a patient tutor. You can painstakingly prove it false, or you can make the source of the lie so utterly, catastrophically unreliable that no one would ever believe a word he says again. We will choose the second method. The operation that followed was a masterpiece of asymmetric warfare. Vincent didn't hire a PR firm. He didn't file a countersuit. Instead, he unleashed his own brand of truth. Phase 1. Flood the zone. At midnight, a decentralized network of bots and real-person accounts began releasing real data, onto dark web forums and niche financial blogs. It started with the mundane, receipts showing Jonathan's psychiatrist owned a vacation home Jonathan had purchased for him. Then it escalated. Bank records showing payments from Jonathan's fund to the tabloid that ran the first hit piece. This wasn't presented as an exposé. It was dumped raw, without commentary, for the internet to piece together. Phase 2 was the gut punch. A video file appeared. It was security footage from inside the Pierce penthouse, dated 8 months earlier. The timestamp, the biometric metadata, all verified as authentic by independent forensic analysts later. In the video, Jonathan is seen screaming at Alina, who is cowering against a wall. He throws a crystal decanter which shatters inches from her head. Then he walks toward the camera, looks directly into it with a sneer, and shuts it off. The source of the leak was a hidden security system Alina had secretly installed a year prior, a fact only Vincent's people had discovered when sweeping the apartment for bugs. He had not just defended her, he had weaponized her own hidden evidence. The internet exploded. The narrative reversed in under 6 hours. Jonathan wasn't a wronged husband. He was a monster who had spied on and terrorized his wife. The forged documents now looked like a desperate smear campaign. The public sympathy swung back, harder, amplified by a fury that was now directed squarely at Jonathan. But Vincent wasn't done. This was the "it gets even bigger" moment. His goal was not vindication, it was eradication. He orchestrated a financial kill shot. Using the obligational web he had woven through years of philanthropy, he triggered a clause in the bylaws of Jonathan's flagship investment fund. A minor, forgotten clause required a unanimous vote from the advisory board for any capital transaction over $50 million during a period of reputational crisis. The board had 7 members. 3 were already leaning against Jonathan. Vincent, through intermediaries, owned the votes of the other 4. They voted to freeze all assets, effectively locking Jonathan out of his own liquidity. Simultaneously, the guided missile evidence sent to the SEC triggered an automatic suspension of Jonathan's broker-dealer license. He was now locked out of the financial system, unable to trade, unable to access capital, unable to pay his astronomical legal fees. The billion-dollar empire was not just under attack, it was being systematically dismantled brick by digital brick. Jonathan Pierce, sitting in a rented hotel suite because his penthouse was now a crime scene, finally understood the true nature of his opponent. This wasn't a business rival. It wasn't even a traditional mob shakedown. This was a total war fought on every battlefield: legal, financial, digital, psychological, and he was losing on all fronts. In a moment of sheer desperation, he made one final, fatal error. He called an old contact, a man with ties to a rival outfit from a neighboring city. He offered them a deal: eliminate Vincent Sokolov, and in return, they could have a controlling stake in what remained of his business. It was the act of a man with nothing left to lose, and it was the worst mistake of his life. Because Vincent Sokolov's protection detail wasn't just for show. His surveillance was omnipresent. The call was intercepted before it was completed. Within 45 minutes, Jonathan's new ally was sitting across from Vincent in a private club, explaining the offer in detail, offering his profound apologies, and assuring Vincent of his continued loyalty. This presented Vincent with a choice. The traditional response would be violence, but Vincent was evolving. He saw a greater opportunity. He instructed the rival to play along, to string Jonathan along to get him to transfer what little unencumbered capital he had left as a good faith payment. It was a financial sting operation run by a crime boss. Over the next 72 hours, Jonathan willingly transferred his last $12 million of accessible cash to a dummy account, believing he was buying his enemy's death. The money vanished into a maze of crypto wallets. Jonathan was now not only ruined, but penniless, and he had done it to himself. The final revelation, the one that changed everything, came not from Vincent, but from Alina's lawyer, Claire. As they reviewed the financial autopsy of Jonathan's empire, she found something strange. A series of shell companies that had been quietly acquiring Pierce Fund debt over the past 18 months. The purchases were small, staggered, and designed to avoid notice. They traced back to a holding company registered in Luxembourg, and that company was ultimately owned by a trust. The beneficiary of the trust was Alina Morty Pierce. Vincent had not been secretly buying Jonathan's debt for himself. He had been buying it for asterisk or asterisk. Every financial blow he landed on Jonathan was, in a convoluted, legally insulated way, transferring ownership of the failing empire's carcass to Alina. He wasn't just destroying Jonathan. He was conducting a hostile takeover and installing Alina as the victor. This was beyond protection. This was an inheritance, engineered through ruin. When confronted with this, Vincent offered no sentimental explanation. His reasoning was chillingly pragmatic. A puppet is useless if its strings are held by a dead man, he told her. You needed capital of your own, independence. Now you will have it. What you do with it is your concern. Alina was no longer just a protected victim. She was being groomed as a successor, an heiress to a fortune built on the ashes of her abuser. The cage, it turned out, was lined with gold and came with the keys to a kingdom. But it was still a cage. Her freedom, her safety, her newfound wealth were all inextricably bound to the most dangerous man she had ever known. The bridge to the final act was not a question of survival. It was a question of identity. Jonathan Pierce was functionally finished, socially obliterated, financially bankrupt, and under multiple federal investigations. But Alina's battle was just beginning. She had escaped her husband. But could she ever escape the man who saved her? And at what cost would her salvation finally be paid? The lesson, as Vincent called it, was nearly complete. But for Alina, the final exam was about to begin. 6 months after the gala, the dust had settled into a new, permanent landscape. Jonathan Pierce was no longer a billionaire. He was inmate number 48721 at a federal correctional facility, awaiting trial on 14 counts of securities fraud, wire fraud, and witness tampering. His bail had been denied, the judge citing his extreme flight risk and pattern of witness intimidation. The empire was gone, liquidated by creditors. The penthouse, the cars, the art collection, all sold at auction. The social annihilation Vincent Sokolov promised was complete. Jonathan Pierce was a ghost. Alina Pierce, however, was very much alive. The divorce was finalized in a closed hearing. She received a settlement, but the real wealth was in the debt holdings Vincent had secretly acquired for her trust. Through a series of complex but legal transactions, she gained controlling interest in the remaining viable assets of the Pierce Fund, a portfolio of commercial real estate and tech investments, valued at just over $180 million. She was, overnight, a wealthy woman in her own right, not an heiress but a principal. She moved out of the safe house and into a penthouse of her own choosing. Vincent's security detail, Leo included, remained at her request but now on her payroll. This was the first clear assertion of her new independence. She was not his kept woman. She was a client. Her public identity transformed. She gave no interviews, made no statements, but she began to quietly direct her foundation, once a vanity project of Jonathan, toward a single cause: funding secure shelters and legal aid for victims of high-net-worth domestic violence. The first donation was $10 million. The press release did not mention her name. It was signed simply, "A Survivor." The message was clear. She was not a society wife. She was a philanthropist with a mission. Her relationship with Vincent Sokolov entered a new, ambiguous phase. They were not romantically involved. They were something harder to define, allies bound by a shared secret and a mutually beneficial arrangement. He would visit her new home occasionally, always announced, always with a business purpose. He advised her on managing the assets she now controlled, his counsel shrewd and devoid of sentiment. She provided him with something equally valuable, a legitimate, positive social connection. Her foundation's galas became events he could attend not as a shadowy mobster, but as a respected donor. His own charitable giving, always strategic, now carried her implicit endorsement. The central promise of the hook, the destruction of a life in one sentence, was fulfilled beyond anyone's imagination. But the deeper question remained, was this justice? The legal system was prosecuting Jonathan for his financial crimes, not for the years of terror inflicted on Alina. That punishment had been delivered extra-legally by a criminal through social and financial means. It was effective, it was brutal, and it left Alina forever tied to a world of shadows. Then came the final, surprising detail that reframed the entire story. It emerged not from a news report, but from a sealed juvenile court record from St. Petersburg, Russia, dated 1989. Vincent Sokolov was 9 years old. His father, a mid-level enforcer in a local brigade, was arrested for the murder of Vincent's mother. The cause of death was blunt force trauma. The police report noted a history of domestic disturbance calls. The case never went to trial. Vincent's father was found dead in his cell 2 days later, ruled a suicide. The unofficial word on the street was that the brigade's boss, a man named Gregor, had ordered it. He had been a frequent guest at the Sokolov home. He had witnessed the abuse. He had done nothing until it ended in murder. Young Vincent went to live with Gregor, who became his mentor and eventually his predecessor. The lesson was not one of compassion, but of power. In Gregor's world, a man who couldn't control his violence was a liability. A man who killed a useful asset, a wife who hosted parties, managed households, was a fool. But for Vincent, the lesson fused with a childhood trauma. His intervention at the gala was not purely strategic. It was personal. He was not saving Alina. He was avenging a 9-year-old boy who stood helpless in a hallway 30 years earlier. He was rewriting his own origin story. This revelation changed everything. His campaign against Jonathan wasn't just a business move or an image play. It was a meticulously crafted revenge fantasy against a ghost, his own father, using Jonathan Pierce as a stand-in. Alina was not just a valuable asset. She was a proxy for his mother. This explained the otherwise irrational depth of his commitment, the transfer of wealth to her, the sheer overkill of the response. He was healing an old wound by inflicting a new one on a deserving target. When Alina learned this through a private investigator she had hired to understand the man who owned her safety, her reaction was complex. There was horror, of course, but also a strange, grim solidarity. They were both survivors of the same disease, just from different sides of the window. His weapon was an empire. Hers had been silence. Now they were both armed. The final loop to close was Jonathan's fate. In prison, isolated and bankrupt, he received a visitor, not his lawyer, Vincent Sokolov. The meeting was not recorded. What was said is known only from Jonathan's hysterical account to his attorney afterward, which was dismissed as the ravings of a broken man. According to Jonathan, Vincent did not threaten him. He simply laid a photograph on the table. It was a picture of Jonathan's mother, who lived in a nursing home in Florida, sitting in a garden. Vincent said nothing. He didn't need to. The message was the same as at the gala. I see everything that matters to you. I can reach anything you love. Your punishment is not over. It is permanent. Jonathan Pierce was convicted on all counts and sentenced to 25 years. He will be nearly 80 when he is eligible for release. He has no money, no family, no friends. The lesson, as Vincent intended, was indeed permanent. For Alina, the path forward is both liberated and circumscribed. She has wealth, autonomy, and a purpose. She is also eternally aware that her security is underwritten by a man capable of breathtaking cruelty. She has chosen to use her position not to hide, but to build a different kind of fortress, one made of legal advocacy and financial clout. She is creating a system where victims don't need a mobster to save them. It is her answer to Vincent's warped justice. The documentary ends not with a neat conclusion, but with a lasting image. At a fundraiser for her foundation, Alina stands at a podium. In the front row, Vincent Sokolov watches, his expression unreadable. She speaks about building bridges out of prisons, about light after darkness. He listens. He does not smile. He simply nods once. It is a partnership forged in trauma and violence, producing an uneasy, powerful, and deeply compromised force for change. The protector and the protected, bound together in a silent pact, walking out of the fire and into a forever twilight. So, what is the final calculus of this story? An abuser was destroyed. A victim was elevated. But the instrument of that justice was a man who operates entirely outside the law. This leaves us with an uncomfortable, enduring question. When the systems designed to protect, the police, the courts, the whispers of polite society, fail utterly, is vigilante justice, however monstrous its source, the only answer? Vincent Sokolov succeeded where every other institution failed. He provided a consequence. He delivered a form of safety. But he did so by weaponizing fear, corruption, and his own traumatic past. He didn't fix a broken system. He proved how easily it could be hijacked by someone with greater power and fewer rules. The research is unequivocal. For every victim like Alina who finds a drastic escape, millions suffer in silence, trapped by economics, by fear, by the simple, devastating fact that leaving is often the most dangerous moment of all. The fantasy of a powerful protector is seductive because the reality is so desperate. But this story warns us that such protectors come with their own chains, their own agendas, and their own moral abysses. Alina's foundation now works to build real, systemic safeguards, legal funds, secure housing, trauma-informed advocacy. It is an attempt to create a ladder out of the darkness that doesn't require a deal with the devil. Whether it can ever match the brutal efficiency of a Vincent Sokolov is an open question. Perhaps the goal isn't to match it, but to make it unnecessary. In the end, this isn't a story about good versus evil. It's a story about broken people using the tools they have, whether those are silence, money, or violence, to survive in a world that often looks the other way. It's about the price of safety, the shape of justice, and the shadows that linger long after the rescue is over. The gala ended, the sentence was spoken, and the consequences are still unfolding in boardrooms, in courtrooms, and in the quiet of 100 homes where someone is wondering if there is any way out at all. The most important question this documentary leaves you with is not about them. It's about you. What would you do if you were her? And what would you become if you were him? Thank you for watching. If these deep dives into the shadows of power and justice matter to you, subscribe for more. We'll see you on the next one.